our costs are going up in many other areas along with, besides just this fuel surcharge issue. So we feel the impact of fuel cost in many ways, and so we can sympathize in that respect with the railroads needing to recover that element of their cost, and so we're not there again echoing the sentiments of other shippers. We're not against railroads recovering that cost. We simply want to see a more equitable mechanism. In recent years, we've seen railroads implement the fuel surcharges even where in the past we've enjoyed negotiated rates, confidential contracts, and pretty much everything that the automotive companies have done with the railroads has been in that arena of negotiated rates and so forth. However, what's happened more recently is the application of the fuel surcharges on top of this, and the fuel surcharges are sort of step outside of that two-party arena and become more of a unilateral mandate on the part of the railroads. Perhaps that was necessary because of the urgency of the situation. But today, we're in the position that, as many have expressed, that we may have gone too far. So, like others, we're seeking, some sort of review of that and a step back and say, okay, where do we go from here? One of the problems that has been stated is that we really haven't seen the detail analysis. We don't have the transparency to really see, okay, what are the fuel charges that are being assessed to automotive companies, collecting the right amount of revenue for the railroads that is equivalent to the increase in fuel costs that it takes to haul our products, to haul our materials into our plants, or are they, making more money? Are they undercompensated? We just don't know. So basically, like others, we've had to go to other sources of information, and there are plenty of them out there, as has been pointed out. So we've gone to those sources of information, and by and large, we've kind of come up with the same conclusions that others have come up with. That it kind of looks like we might be paying too much, and this is based on a lot of public information in terms of how much railroads are paying for fuel, and then of course the more confidential information in terms of how much we're paying in fuel surcharges. So basically, by doing this kind of an end-around analysis, I guess, the Alliance has come to the conclusion that the mechanisms are flawed, and in fact work to the financial advantage of the railroads at this point in time. And as a result, we believe that the ability to mandate these fuel surcharges has become somewhat of a profit center for the railroads, and it's even starting to show up in some of the materials that railroads are publishing to their stockholders, and I'm sure others in the room have seen those. So, and as has been pointed out, the increases in the surcharges don't necessarily correlate to increases when the fuel itself rises or remains steady. So basically, to summarize the specific issues that the Alliance would present, number one, the current revenue-based surcharge, our percentage of the rate charge, do not correlate with the actual fuel cost incurred by the railroads on those shipments. Again, this is echoing what some of the other shippers have said. So what that results in is that for higher value materials like finished vehicles, where the rate is sometimes predicated on the value of the materials that are being shipped or the product that's being shipped, part of what's factored into the rate is the risk that the railroad is taking by handling this high value product, which is probably appropriate in terms of setting the rate. Unfortunately, when you apply the fuel surcharge to that rate, now you're paying fuel on top of the value portion of the rate. So we're paying for fuel on the value of our product. Well, because the price of fuel went up, it doesn't cost more to ship this high-value product. And this is similar to other points that have been made along those lines. One of the points that we wanted to bring up that it's also been mentioned was the appropriateness of the use of the West Texas Intermediate crude as a reference point or an index to adjust rates. Some of the information that we have suggests that since 2001 the price of West Texas crude has actually gone up at almost double the rate of diesel fuel. So if you look at the index being used to establish the fuel surcharges, we really wind up paying too much surcharge, and then it kind of doesn't swing the other way, because if it comes down to the baseline, then we don't, and the West Texas crude being a more volatile index falls below that baseline, then we don't get compensated for that. One of the things that we question is that one of the things we're hearing from the railroads is that they're becoming more fuel efficient, and we applaud that, and we hope that continues. In a paper that was authored by the AAR, which is entitled "The Overview of U.S. Freight Railroads," which is just published the first this year, they cite the fact that the railroads are 3 times more fuel efficient than trucks, and railroad fuel economy is improving all the time. Our experience, however, is that despite using 1/3 less fuel and improving all the time, we're actually paying on a proportional basis higher fuel surcharges for rail than we are for highway carriers. So there again, it leads us to wonder, what is this mechanism working right, and come to the conclusion that it probably isn't working right. And then our fourth issue is that we find it frustrating that we don't have the ability to get the information from the railroads to justify the surcharge methodologies. The requests for supporting documentation basically are rebuffed, and the surcharges have become non-negotiable. It's just like, if fuel went up, here's your charge. So in summary, there are 4 things that we're basically requesting from the board. Number 1, surcharges should cover only the increased cost of fuel and not be a new source of profit for the railroads. Number 2, railroads should fully disclose both cost and revenue data related to fuel purchases and fuel surcharges. So in other words, we see both sides of the ledger. And number 3, surcharges must be based on the price of locomotive diesel fuel used by the railroads and not some other index. And then finally, number 4, railroads move from a rate-based surcharge to a consumption-based surcharge, and that would be something along the line of ton miles or something like that. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Alliance for conducting this hearing. I think it's a very worthwhile thing to do, and I really appreciate being here.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ness?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman.
Are you and Mr. Rummel appearing together? Is that the way it's working?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
I'll do the first half, and Mr. Rummel will do the second half of our testimony. Thank you for allowing Amaranth to address the board this morning on the subject of fuel surcharges. My name is Robert Neff. It's actually FF instead of SS. And I'm the Vice President of Coal Supply for Amaranth Energy Fuels and Services in St. Louis, Missouri. My responsibilities include the acquisition of coal and related transportation for all of Amaranth's electric subsidiaries. The purpose of my testimony this morning is to address the impact of railroad fuel surcharges on Amaranth's coal-fired generation. This testimony is given in support of Amaranth's written comments, which were filed previously with the board. Amaranth is the largest shipper of Powder River Basin coal in the country, shipping over 35 million tons annually. 10 of Amaranth's plants rely on rail service as their primary mode of receiving their fuel. Our average haul is over 1,000 miles, and our annual freight costs are expected to be over $550 million in 2007. As are many shippers, our transportation of coal is transitioning from fixed-priced confidential contracts to public pricing tariffs. And these new public pricing tariffs that are being implemented by the Western carriers all contain a non-negotiable fuel surcharge, which will have a significant impact on Amaranth's coal generation and Amaranth's customers. As an example, assuming that the on-highway diesel index remains at its April 15, 2006 level of $2.70 per gallon, Amaranth's fuel surcharges next year will add up to $83 million. And as with other shippers, the amount of the fuel surcharge that Amaranth pays will go up and down depending on the price of a fuel-related diesel index. Clearly, the fuel surcharge will amount to a large sum of money for Amaranth and its customers. We in turn will have to recover that amount from our customers. And now Amaranth does not dispute that railroads should be able to recover their increases in fuel costs. We have generation in coal, natural gas, and fuel oil, and we're familiar with volatility in fuel markets and the need to recover fuel costs. Utilities have an even larger percentage of their production cost tied to fuel than do the railroads. And most utilities are familiar with fuel hedging and fuel cost recovery methods. First of all, we want to say fuel cost recovery should not be a mystery to the parties involved. Utilities have been recovering changes in their fuel costs for years through fuel adjustment clauses, purchase gas adjustment mechanisms, and similar regulated tools. Utilities understand the importance of recovering fuel costs, but they also understand that customers and regulators must be able to understand and be comfortable with the fuel adjustment mechanism. Looking at utility fuel pass-through clauses that are generally regulated by state public service commissions, we found that what we would call 4 common attributes of fairness, and I posted these on the screen here. The first attribute of fairness we would recall is the recovery of utility fuel costs should be based on actual costs that the utilities incur. The second attribute of fairness is that utility pass-through mechanisms are transparent. We've heard that term a lot this morning, of transparency of costs. That means all parties should know what costs are included, how the costs are calculated, and the methodology of the calculation. The third point is that utilities are not allowed to over-recover or benefit from their cost recovery of fuel. It is strictly recovery. And the fourth point is that utilities are required to take actions to minimize the impact of volatile price changes in commodities like fuel through hedging programs and prudent purchasing practices. Amaranth believes that these attributes of fairness which are applied to utilities should also be applied to the railroad cost recovery mechanisms, but we find that none of these characteristics are present in the fuel surcharge mechanisms as currently practiced by the railroads. Many of the previous speakers have expressed the same thoughts. It is Amaranth's position that the fuel surcharge mechanisms imposed by the railroads in their public pricing tariffs do not adequately reflect the true costs of their increases, are not transparent enough to provide comfort to the customers that the charges are fair, and are not structured to prevent over-recovery of fuel costs. To address these issues further, Amaranth has retained a recognized expert who specializes in contract escalations, and we'd like to turn the remainder of our time over to Mr. Jay Roman of Escalation Consultants.
Good morning. Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey, I appreciate the opportunity to address the board regarding fuel surcharges on behalf of Amaranth, and really commend the board for having this hearing. As you can see from the large number of people we have in this room, it's a pretty hot topic. People are really interested in it, and I think everybody appreciates the attention that you're giving to this issue. I'm here today on behalf of Amaranth to explain irregularities in the manner which railroads are imposing fuel surcharges on shippers. At Escalation Consultants, we do quite a bit of work with fuel surcharges, and our findings support the prior testimony of Amaranth that there are problems with the railroad fuel surcharge programs. The first point of fairness made by Amaranth, which is up on the board, is that fuel surcharge cost recovery should be based on actual costs incurred by railroads. This is contrary to the methodologies established by railroads in these programs. As an example, both Western railroads use the on-highway diesel fuel price to initiate their fuel surcharges. This is a retail price index that is reflective of what on-highway vehicles pay for diesel fuel. This is not reflective of how the railroads incur their costs. All the Class I railroads buy diesel fuel in bulk and pay wholesale prices, not retail prices for fuel. The larger problem is, however, that fuel surcharges are applied against the entire rate rather than just the portion of the rate associated with fuel expenses. This application increases the portions of the price for things other than fuel, like labor and benefits and overhead, lots of expenses as well as profit. The surcharge programs railroads employ are very distant from the actual costs they incur, and this causes serious concerns about the accuracy of these programs. Based upon my more than 30 years of experience with price escalation issues, I find that if you are escalating a very volatile cost like fuel, by an escalation method that is not closely related to the cost that's actually being incurred, you're going to get very inaccurate results. And the analysis that we've done of this demonstrates that's what's happening. Amaranth's point of fairness number 2 is that fuel pass-through mechanisms need to be transparent, and that all parties need to know what costs are included. We've heard that a lot here today. Rail fuel surcharges are based on fuel costs in late 2001 and early 2002. As a result, there are now a total of 4 years of escalation included in these programs. It is not clear why surcharge programs allow railroads to charge shippers for 4 years of escalation on top of current rates. But what we do know is that these surcharge programs are asking shippers to accept that none of the large rate increases they have received since 2001 cover any portion of the increase in fuel expenses that have occurred in the last 4 years. It is very difficult to accept this assumption without any type of documentation from railroads, which demonstrates it's an accurate assumption. From an analyst standpoint, the greater the number of years of fuel escalation included in these surcharges, the less transparent these surcharges become. In the future, as we get even farther away from the base fuel costs in these surcharges, farther away from 2001, this lack of transparency with these programs is going to increase. Amaranth's point of fairness number 3, that fuel surcharges should not allow over-recovery, is in conflict with the railroad's fuel surcharge programs because these programs appear to double count fuel cost increases. The fuel surcharge programs of railroads are essentially asking shippers to accept that railroads are recovering the increased cost of expenses like labor and overhead through rate increases over the last 4 years, but at the same time, there is no recovery for the increased cost of fuel. This is very difficult to accept, and it's a reason many shippers are concerned that fuel surcharges are double counting fuel cost increases. Concerns about double counting of fuel increases are not being ameliorated by railroads, as they have not provided anything to demonstrate the fuel cost increases since 2001 have been broken out from other expenses and removed from rates. Many shippers have incurred large rate increases over the last 4 years, and this makes it hard to accept that none of these increases cover any portion of the railroad's increased cost of fuel. Amaranth's 4th and final point of fairness is that railroads should be expected to minimize their fuel expenses through hedging programs and prudent purchasing practices. Railroads, like public utilities, should have the obligation to keep costs down to the best of their abilities. This includes utilizing a well-thought-out, reasonable hedging program with both financial and physical hedging. As substantial consumers of fuel oil, railroads are in a unique position of being able to perform large-scale physical hedging, and in many cases they're already doing this. As the consumer of the actual commodity, the railroad's ability to hedge is much better than that of the shipper, and railroads should strive to maintain the lowest fuel cost possible. In conclusion, Escalation Consultants finds that the current fuel surcharge programs are illogical and, I must say, also confusing. Our analysis also demonstrates that railroads are over-recovering their fuel costs through these programs. This afternoon, in the consultants portion of this hearing, I'll demonstrate how that is happening and some numbers on that issue. Also this afternoon, our proposal on how railroads' reporting requirements should be adjusted to provide rail customers and regulators with better information on carriers' fuel costs and the revenue collected through these surcharges will also be presented. This concludes my testimony, and I thank you for allowing me to address the board on this issue today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank the entire panel for being here today and for presenting testimony in the hearing. There seems to be a lot of interest among the shipper groups in finding some type of index that might be used for any type of analysis in the future. And I was wondering if there's any kind of unanimity out there on this panel about what that index might be. There are people who say that, or there are those who say that that coming up with some type of nationwide index would not be appropriate because fuel prices fluctuate because of geographic differences around the country. Nobody has convinced the Fed, apparently, of that argument, but I'd be interested in knowing what your thoughts are on that.
There is a proposal or a recommendation that we'll be making this afternoon, which these surcharges are applied against revenue, and they're applied against revenue to generate the increase in money that the railroads need to recover their fuel expenses. So you have this relationship between fuel expenses and revenue. There could be an index that would be formed which would reflect what fuel expenses are as a percentage of revenue. And if that is formed into an index, that change would be reflective of how essentially it would make sure that the railroads would be no better off or no worse off than they were before fuel costs actually increased. But I'll go into that more in the presentation this afternoon.
May I add to that? I think in the presentation that I made, which seems like hours ago,
We still remember it.
And it will seem longer before this day's over.
I showed you two graphs, and the graphs measured the change in the index you already published, the fuel component of the RCAF unadjusted, pretty well tracks the changes in both BN's and UP's fuel costs. So I think you have the mechanism in hand to track actual fuel cost changes.
Right. And
Other comments?
From the automotive industry, I think we would align with what Mr. Oman has said with regard to some sort of an index that comes right from the railroad's actual costs. I think he's suggesting that the actual cost be used as a percentage of revenue and then track the fluctuation as a percentage. But adding to that, which maybe doesn't need to be added, but I will, is that by no means means that we would want to stay with the surcharge applied to the rates. So while the index would be derived as a percentage fluctuation of fuel versus revenue, that doesn't mean that we would apply it to the revenue, but we'd prefer to have it applied to some other measure such as ton miles.
Mr. Ness, the grain shippers and the ag shippers this morning seem to think that you're getting a pretty good deal on your shipping fuel surcharges. I don't know whether you're in the room or not, but they seem to think that you're really coming out pretty good in this. Apparently, there is this huge difference between the fuel surcharge that's being applied to grain and to coal. Can you explain? Do you have any explanations of why that might be true?
No, we don't ship any grain. I wasn't really aware of the differences until this morning. We look mostly at our coal rates, so I can't explain the difference.
Okay. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I'll just add that we demonstrated in our testimony that the surcharges as applied to coal movements, the railroads are over-recovering. And so there may be a difference in degree of over-recovery, but certainly coal shippers do not believe they are getting a good deal under the current implementation.
I didn't have that impression, but the grain shippers seem to think you're getting a really good deal as compared to them, anyway. You have a question, right?
Everything is relative, I suppose. We've heard a lot of discussion about the methodologies and the fairness of the way in which fuel surcharges are calculated, what should be the proper indices, etc. But in many of your testimonies, you address the issue of the board's authority. This is fairly critical. What is the board's authority in this area? There was some reference to the ICC's ex parte 311 hearing. I think in that hearing, the commission was more favorably inclined to look at the RCAF as a way of dealing with fuel increases rather than fuel surcharges. But having said that, could any of you, and most of your testimonies did, and I think all did a very, very good job in addressing this issue of the board's authority, can any of you care to comment on whether or not the board has authority, whether or not this, in fact, is an unreasonable practice versus whether or not it's simply a rate and should therefore, if we're going to consider it, we should only consider it in the context of a rate case?
From Entergy's perspective, we segregate what the base rate would consist of compared to fuel costs, and we think this fuel cost is an adjustment and not a rate that would come under your authority. And as both Mr. Neff and myself have testified, this is not uncommon at all, and we're simply looking for a reasonable way and a practical way to ensure the railroads get compensated for fuel, and their base rate issues remain outside of your jurisdiction. But these adjustments, we believe, strongly come under your jurisdiction.
Others on this issue? This is a critical issue.
Right, and I think, and I'm certainly not a legal expert, but I think from the automotive perspective, what we tried to state was that we enjoy the environment that we've existed in the last 25 years. We think that it's done a lot for the partnership between the automotive shippers and the railroads, and we want to continue with that arrangement with regard to rates. However, the fuel surcharge has not been presented by the railroads as a rate issue, but simply a means of recovering this uncontrollable cost. We support the recovery of that uncontrollable cost, but we question the methodology. So therefore, I would say it's not a rate negotiation issue, but more of a methodology issue that needs some oversight.
Well, at least one of the railroads this afternoon or tonight will be discussing the issue as to whether or not it's a rate or a practice, because it will make a difference as how we deal with it. A number of you addressed some of the law. Both Mr. Buttry and I have pointed out that the precedent in this area is fairly thin. But you have all cited some cases. I'd like to hear what you
There
think
are a
about.
couple of decisions early on. I guess the Parrish Hecker cases. I guess I'm sure I butchered the name, but where there used to be the light density fuel surcharge and commodity surcharge under, I guess, 107.052 or whatever. That was there was a statutory authorization for surcharges, and then that was repealed. And I believe in one of those decisions, the board or the ICC then said that that authority's gone away, but the board still has jurisdiction under 107.02 for unreasonable practices. I think you'd said something earlier that that I think that it depends on how it's assessed, and I think the cases are all over the map, but I think there is authority for treating the manner in which the actual mechanism does what it said, what it was represented to do, whether that's a reasonable practice or not. And so it's sort of a bottom-up analysis from whether you can set standards that, in effect, will establish the level of the surcharge, but really from the bottom up in terms of what are the correct parameters to establish them.
There's always this issue of fairness versus reasonableness. Everybody wants things to be fair, but our charge is to be reasonable, and whether or not what the railroads are doing is a reasonable practice. If the railroads couldn't cross-subsidize, and we all recognize that the railroads are unable to levy fuel surcharges on all the traffic that they have because of contractual restrictions. Therefore, if they could only level specific cost-based surcharges on the traffic where they could assess them, and had to eat, if you like, the other cost increases on those contracts where they couldn't, and we'll talk later about what percentage that is, what would that do to the railroads' bottom line, and would that really hurt the railroads in terms of their ability to make the investments in the infrastructure that everybody is so concerned about for capacity? The coal companies and the shipping and the utilities are especially concerned about making investments in, say, the Powder River Basin to make sure that the coal is flowing. Would we compromise that if the railroads couldn't recover their total costs, even if it meant some cross-subsidization?
I don't think your premise is quite correct. You're assuming that that all of the people that don't get this so-called fuel surcharge, all of the contracts that don't have a specific fuel surcharge, are not paying the increased cost associated with fuel. I think that basic premise is incorrect. I think I demonstrated this morning that if you have an RCAF or if you have any index in your contract, that is recognizing the increase in fuel. If it's the RCAF, it's in the railroad industry. If it's a GDP, IPD, or some other general economy index, that recognizes the increases in fuel in the industry as well. So I think we're talking more about a timing issue than a recovery issue. I think the timing is, there's a slight difference in the timing between when the fuel surcharge is implemented and when the RCAF is implemented. But that's all it is. This doesn't compromise monies for investment in infrastructure at all.
Well, the RCAF comes out quarterly, and I guess the real fuel numbers are available monthly. Would it be possible to come up with some sort of new RCAF which would take into account the more current changes in fuel costs? So we'd have, say, an RCAF monthly fuel index, an RCAF M. We have enough of these now, but a fourth RCAF, if you like, an RCAF MF, which would have the monthly fuel cost adjustments along with the regular RCAF changes, which come quarterly.
I don't think there's any problem with having a more frequent RCAF. I think that's something that can be done. But again, I'm not sure that it's necessary. In the development of the quarterly RCAF, the Association of American Railroads is forecasting what they think the fuel price will be, and that is what you're basing your RCAF increase on. So if their models are not correctly forecasting, then it's caught up in the next quarter. But if they're over forecasting, they over recover in that quarter. So to the extent we're talking about some slight noise here in the difference between what the forecast is and what the actual is for that particular quarter. But if you want to go more frequently, but stay with what you have. It's working. Just make sure that it's implemented.
Mr. Roman, there was, maybe I heard this wrong, but there seemed to be some suggestion this morning that there might be some way for these fuel surcharges to be calculated on a per car rate depending on the commodity or the merchandise being shipped. Is that something that makes sense to you? Maybe even the whole panel here. Is that something that might have any merit or?
Well, it depends. There's lots of things you can do to have the fuel surcharge based on the actual cost for the movement. And I mean, from an economist standpoint, I mean, you would always like to have the method as closely related to the costs that are being incurred as possible. It's just a question of how much administrative time and efforts associated with developing that escalation method. I mean, the railroads' complaint is that we don't want to have 1,000 different the different things that we need to administer right here. It certainly can be done. It's a question of the administration that it actually takes to do it.
When you say administration, you're talking about the software development.
Well, the software development, and it takes more people to do 1,000 different ways than it takes to do one. But I actually think this issue that we're addressing here, and if you really want to solve this, there's really two problems. One is the fuel surcharges the railroads are applying, and the other is the board really needs to have the information in front of them to really see how these provisions are performing. And some of the things in determining what you actually want to have, I think you have to have the data in front of you to show how well they're performing, because if you want to structure something that's more closely related to the actual changes in cost, you need to know what's good and bad about the current fuel surcharges. And I guess we've looked at it is you need the input. You need a certain amount of information for the board to very quickly and easily analyze these programs. Once you know how these programs are performing, it's much easier to actually develop what you actually want with these fuel surcharges. And I look at a little of this, as Tom was saying, maybe you can just use the RCAF. You can use existing things that are there. But regardless of what you do use, I think if there's something that could be good to come out of this, it would be that the board would have the information they need to really have an educated assessment of how well these surcharges actually are performing. And that, to me, I thought of as the first step. There's lots of things that can be developed, but if they're not going to make it any better, or if they're going to be too onerous, things kind of get knocked by the wayside for various reasons. And some of my presentation this afternoon gets into things that could be very helpful to the board to really see, to make a better assessment of these programs, and then go on from there.
Yes, Mr. Tefler. In your testimony, you talked about the fact that you were not a captive shipper, but isn't it true that the percentage of the automobiles now moving out of your plants has grown from about 40% when the exemption was granted to your industry as an exempt industry, an exempt commodity, to 75% today?
I'm not familiar with that statistic, and my tenure in transportation goes back to just after the implementation of the Staggers Act. So my experience prior to that was in the plants and in the flow of materials in the plants. However, going back the last 20 years, let's say, I don't think that our percentage of vehicles within my company that are shipped by rail has appreciably increased. I think it's been right around the 70 to 75% level. Whether that's changed substantially for other automotive shippers, I just don't know. Certainly, the importers who have, several of our members are importers/transplants. And for those companies, over that period of time, they've migrated from importing a lot of their product, which would have necessarily involved a lot of rail shipping from the coast in, even though the coastal areas are heavier market areas, to shipping from domestic plants, and that warrants a whole different distribution pattern. So some of those kinds of things could be influencing that too.
I am interested in this idea of double dipping. Mr. Tricali, you're suggesting that the railroads today are pretty much fully recovering their increased cost of fuel through the RCAF, and that the fuel surcharges that they're receiving above and beyond that really are just going to the bottom line, and they are most of them are in excess of what the fuel cost increases have been. Is that fair to say?
That's fair.
Okay. Okay, well, that's all I have then, too, for the time being. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. We have about 17 minutes until we are breaking for our lunch break. We're going to try to keep that schedule. So the next panel, which is the third panel, Concerned Captive Coal Shippers, Total Petrochemicals USA, Inc., Arkansas Electric Cooperative Corporation, Degussa Corporation, Potluck Forest Products Corporation, Griffin Industries, and Granite Rock. I'd just like to put the panel on notice, if we could, for housekeeping purposes here, that we're probably going to have to break this into two pieces. Maybe not equally break it, but we're going to try to adjourn here at 12, or as close to 12 as we can comfortably do that, and then reconvene at 1 o'clock. So I'll put the panel on notice of that here. We'll get as far as we can, and then we'll break. So I'd like to welcome the panel to the Surface Transportation Board today, and we'll proceed as we have been proceeding from my left to right. So if everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and start.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Buttry and Vice Chairman Mulvey. My name is Michael Loftus. I'm appearing along with Mr. Heller on behalf of the Concerned Captive Coal Shipper Group that has filed comments. The members of that group are listed in the comments. I would like to make a few quick points and then turn it over to Mr. Heller. First, we'd like to applaud the board for initiating this proceeding on what is a very important issue for coal shippers, as reflected in what you've already heard. Second, we believe that the board clearly has jurisdiction to deal with the reasonableness of the railroad's fuel adjustment mechanisms as rules and practices. We do not believe that an argument to the effect that the fuel surcharge has to be considered an integral part of the rate and can only be viewed as an issue relating to the reasonableness of the overall rate is a sound argument. And I would direct your attention in that regard to pleadings filed by Norfolk Southern in docket number 42072, Carolina Power and Light Company v. Norfolk Southern Railway Company. That issue arose, as you may recall, in the initial decision in CP&L. The board found the rates to be unreasonable, and then an issue arose as to whether the fuel surcharge could be assessed on those rates. And if you'll look at NS's filings on June 4 and on June 18 on that fuel surcharge issue, you will see that they characterized the fuel surcharge as a rule or practice and not as a part of the rate. Third, we believe the board correctly articulated the issue that you should be looking at in this matter, and that is, are the revenues being recovered through the fuel surcharge mechanisms, quote, directly and closely correlated to increases in the cost of fuel for the particular movement to which the surcharges apply. We believe that is clearly the question you should be examining. And as Mr. Heller will address, we think it is very clear that the existing fuel surcharge mechanisms do not satisfy that standard. Fifth, the concerned captive coal shippers group requests that the board declare in this proceeding that to be reasonable, a fuel surcharge mechanism should satisfy the standard I referenced a moment ago. Second, you should give the railroads a reasonable period of time to develop conforming fuel surcharge mechanisms. Then, after that period has passed, you should, on complaint, disallow any fuel surcharge mechanism that does not conform to that standard. And finally, we urge the board to direct the railroads to report additional fuel-related data to the board as we have set forth in our comments. Thank you. Mr. Heller.
Thank you, Chairman Buttrey, Vice Chairman Mulvey. My statement specifically analyzes the manner in which fuel surcharges are currently being implemented for specific coal movements. In my testimony, I've compared the incremental fuel costs incurred by a specific railroad resulting from higher diesel fuel prices associated with specific movements to the incremental revenues that they're receiving under the various fuel surcharge mechanisms for the coal traffic. I performed this incremental cost versus incremental fuel surcharge revenue analysis for 3 typical coal movements for the period 2003 through 2005. One was an eastern movement, 2 were western movements, one using the revenue-based fuel surcharge mechanism and the other using the BNSF mileage-based surcharge mechanism. Under each of these scenarios, using typical rates and distances for coal movements, I showed that the fuel surcharge significantly over-recovers the actual diesel fuel cost incurred by the railroads for each of these movements, not dissimilar to testimony you've heard from others. In the case of the eastern movement on the Norfolk Southern, the recovery was 265% more in fuel surcharge revenue than it occurred in additional costs over the same period. I know that the NS has since decided to alter its approach, as was discussed previously, and intends to embed the fuel surcharges in the base rates. Under the existing approach, which provides a shipper with minimal data about the fuel surcharge over collections, I don't know that this approach accomplishes anything much more than making it more difficult, it was pointed out previously, to assess what portion of fuel surcharge revenues fuel increases are recovered under other mechanisms versus the fuel surcharge mechanism. In the case of the Burlington Northern, using the revenue-based fuel surcharge mechanism in place during 2005, I calculated that the fuel surcharge generated 84% more revenue for a typical coal movement than the BN incurred in increased diesel fuel costs. I then did the same calculation using the BN implemented car mile mechanism, same movement parameters, and found that the example coal movement recovered 127% more in fuel surcharge revenue than the movement incurred in diesel cost increases. This doesn't imply that a car mile based fuel surcharge mechanism will always recover more than one based on revenue. It depends on the rate levels, the movement, and the distances involved. But it does indicate that simply switching the form of the fuel surcharge does not necessarily remedy the over-recovery issue. The level of the fuel surcharge, even if it is based on parameters that more closely parallel the costs incurred in a movement, is important. While the focus is on the fuel surcharge, it is important, as Mr. Crowley pointed out, to note that many railroad rates are also subject to the RCAF. In my paper, I've shown the increase in the RCAF between the first quarter of 2003 and the fourth quarter of 2005. Over half of the RCAF increase during that period, or in a rate equivalent to 2.7% of the actual rate, is driven by fuel price. While the railroad's focus seems to be on comparing fuel surcharge revenues with changes in diesel costs, it's important to note that fuel surcharge is not now and never has been their only cost recovery mechanism for increases in fuel prices. When measuring the relationship between revenues recovered by the carriers from their fuel-based cost adjustment mechanisms, it's important to consider the impact of the RCAF as well as the fuel surcharge. Hedging has also been used by many of the carriers, as discussed previously, to mitigate the impact of diesel fuel price increases. I noted that some of the carrier submissions before this panel explicitly exclude the effects of hedging when they compare fuel surcharge recovery with increased diesel fuel costs. This will generally, in the current environment, cause the railroad comparisons to overstate the cost increases that they have incurred. It also appears from various sites which I present in my paper, from the financial reports of the individual carriers as well as financial analyst reports, that during the last 3 years, some of the carriers took in more in fuel surcharge revenue than their increase in fuel costs. As the carriers apply their fuel surcharge to a greater volume of coal traffic carrying higher base rates, as was pointed out previously, the effect of the fuel surcharge over time will likely be to accelerate the discrepancy between changes in diesel-related movement costs and the fuel surcharges. With regard to your question about reporting mechanisms, I recommend that the board collect and make available to shippers data which would better demonstrate this relationship between revenue collected as a result of fuel price increases under both a fuel surcharge program and the diesel component of the RCAF or other cost recovery mechanisms as a prelude to considering exactly what form of fuel surcharge would better match movement-specific revenues and costs. I'm not sure that data is available right now. I present specifics in my paper on types of data that are needed for that. The railroad's contention that a movement-specific cost analysis would be unwieldy could be true if it was done with very granular data, but I don't think that's necessary. Whole spectrums of options exist between a percentage-based fuel surcharge and something that looks like an IRCS cost analysis. A program, for example, that aligns movement-specific fuel surcharge revenues and costs could use metrics such as car miles or gross ton miles rather than a revenue basis for assessing the fuel surcharge. However, as the BNSF example shows, simply switching to a distance-based measure doesn't necessarily rectify the over-recovery problem. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you.
Thank you very much. I think what we're going to do now, instead of interrupting Mr. Slavin right in the middle of his comments, is to break here for lunch and reconvene the hearing promptly at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much.
A little bit of 6-year-old family-owned construction materials and general engineering contractor in 1992. We were the recipient of the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. Granite Rock has been doing business with the railroad for its entire 106 years, as the very foundation of the company was first centered around supplying railroad ballast to the railroads for expansion. The company now supplies construction aggregates from Wilson Quarry near Watsonville, California, to rail-served locations from San Jose to San Francisco. Those are hauls from 40 to 90 miles. These branch locations rely solely on the Union Pacific for daily rail service, as congestion on highways and surrounding neighborhoods makes delivery of aggregates by truck impractical and undesired by local municipalities. In the peak construction season, our rail shipments run between 90 and 115 rail cars per day. This averages out to anywhere between 11,000 and 18,000 rail cars per year. The nation is again experiencing an unpredictable large increase in the cost of diesel fuel, as we all know. The increased diesel expense is a fact of life that all American businesses must deal with, and we believe that the use of a fair fuel surcharge program is an acceptable method for recovering the unpredictable fuel cost increases. A fair fuel surcharge program only recovers the additional fuel expense and nothing more. The current UP fuel surcharge is rate-based using the national HDL average.